Hello, my name is DJ Samuel Amy, and I'm going to be doing a deck spotlight today. The deck we are breaking down today is Warlock Imp. This deck is one of the best decks for new players and returning players that are trying to climb a ranked ladder, and I personally have peaked at Diamond 1 while using this deck, and it only cost me 8,400 dust to make. While I was climbing with this deck, I did most of the climbing on my YouTube stream. This deck is good and requires less skill than other decks of similar caliber, but it requires its own set of skills. I would rank this deck out of difficulty. I would give it a 3 out of 10. With this deck spotlight, I plan on thoroughly giving a walkthrough of this deck. Timestamps below, let's get straight into it. First thing to notice about the deck is the curve is rather low besides a few big cards. This Imp deck in particular doesn't have any filler cards such as a Bloodbound Imp. Every card here has a purpose. It's just your responsibility as the player to make sure your cards can complete their purpose. Expect to play more cards in comparison to your opponent. There are very strong early turns which pretty much every deck will have an issue when it comes to being able to recover from. The deck's early game revolves around Flustered Librarian with a combination of Vile Library with a variation of Imp cards. Flustered Librarian and Vile Library can put a lot of damage on your opponent in early turns, especially with the combination of Fiendish Circle. Hypothetically, by turn 2, if you were to play Fiendish Library in your first turn and go second, and coin for Fiendish Circle, you can have a 5/3 that can attack with also another 4/1/1s by turn 2, and to be honest, this synergy is super easy to pull off. Impending Catastrophe, in my opinion, is the only reason the deck is as viable as it is. This card used right can make it very easy for players to pick up their whole entire deck by the end of the game. This card with Fiendish Circle can let you draw 5 cards for 5 mana on turn 5 with nothing else on the field, as well as give you 4/1/1 Imps. This is absolutely insane. Most draw spells cost more and give you much less value. Impending Catastrophe and Fiendish Circle, in my opinion, are the best 2 cards in this deck and should always be taken early. Imp Gang Boss isn't the best card to play for aggression. It is rather slow compared to most of these cards in this deck. It is a great option when you're worried about your opponent clearing your field though. It is a great way to have an extra Imp that can still attack next turn on your field, and this card is usually played for board control, not for maximum damage on your opponent. Murlocula is a great way to cover from board wipes and can be used with Vile Library. Even though this card is not an Imp, if you have a field full of Imps and pump Murlocula up with Vile Library, you can use the lifelink to recover some clutch health when your health gets low. Blade Master Okani is in this deck, and he's a really good card. Okani is an easy card to get a 2-for-1 trade or more, but at the same time being very versatile. Okani is a fantastic option to put down turn 4 when you're already beating your opponent down by countering the next creature that would come out, but sometimes I'll change out what I counter depending on what deck I'm playing, but most of the times I just counter the next creature, because the issue with countering spells compared to creatures is your opponent can use coins and small spells to bait out effects. So pay attention if they have coin or not. Shady Bartender is great when you have a full field of demons and you can put out tons of damage on the field pretty much spontaneously. When this card's played, it makes the player's win rate go up quite a bit. Overall, a great card when you get its effect onto 3 or more demons, but one of the worst cards to draw early. Mischievous Imps is a great card. I pretty much always play this card in Fuse. Getting that extra Imp from this Fuse effect is a great option for flooding a field with stronger Imps, and when played on turn 4, can pretty much end games at times. It is one of the better cards in this whole entire deck. Imp Swarm evolves 2 times, once at 5 mana and again at 10 mana. Each time this evolves, it increases the amounts of imps that are spawned by 1. I really don't like using this card unless it has evolved at least once, but that requires 5 mana. This card is deceivably bad in starting hands, so watch out for that. Talking about the last few big cards in this deck, I have Dreadlich Tams in this deck, which is a great hero card. It provides a field wipe as well as a way to pick up extra cards on top, as provides some extra 3/3 imps with an improved hero power. Overall, a great card. Imp King Reform is basically a Shady Bartender but summons imps when summoned. This card is a great way to recover after a board wipe for when you want immediate board control with a field full of stronger minions. Finally, there is Sire Daenerys, who is the final and last measure to kill your opponent. Sometimes when you play against certain decks such as Cough Cough Priest decks, they will kill so many of your minions through the game. By turn 10, your Sire will have over enough damage to one-shot their hero. Sire has inched out quite a few wins for me and is the final win condition of this deck. That sums up the cards we are going over. It's time to talk about the playstyle of this deck. This deck has a very aggro heavy playstyle. With this deck, I want to focus on trading and getting better value than your opponent. The only time I ever focus on value with this deck is when I'm playing against an aggro druid or a Murloc deck. But besides that, I tend to focus on my opponent's health. With this deck, you should be putting so much pressure on your opponent they should struggle to respond to your moves, let alone secure field control in the first 5 turns. By turn 4 or 5, I like to have my opponents at least half health If you don't put a solid pace on your opponent early, most decks will eventually outpace this deck in the later turns. From what I found with this deck, most players that are pre-diamond will struggle a lot with the pressure in which this deck brings. The name of the game with this deck is I bet I can kill you before you can kill me. On screen is a tier list of what the best cards are to get in a starting hand. The higher the tier, the better the card is for a starting hand. When looking at this tier list, I wouldn't settle for anything below B tier when you're a mulliganing. B tier are cards that are very situational and require certain cards for better utility. Mischievous Imps can work fairly well if you get a Fiendish Circle with it. A tier are just all around solid cards to pick up early. They provide plenty of pressure early and can put a lot of early damage on your opponent. Getting as many Fiendish Circles and impending catastrophes is most ideal. You'll be able to draw so many cards early and apply so much pressure, it's hard for your opponent to react most of the time. This wraps up the Mulligan options. Fiendish into Impending. This combo has been one of the ones I've been talking about throughout this video. This is a great combo to hit a lot of extra cards in times when you might be running out of steam. Vile Library into Fiendish. These two cards works wonders together. This is a great way to put some damage down on your opponent's hero when you have an extra creature that is up on your board. You'll be able to make that creature that was only a 3/2 become something like huge, like a 7/6 or 8/7 creature, which your opponent will need to take care of immediately. Mischievous Imp and Fiendish. This combo can be set up fairly early in the game. What this combo gives you the option of being able to trade with all your 1/1 imps that you get from Fiendish Circle, and then putting down next turn 3/3/3 imps on your turn 4. This is a great way to get your deck going and get some early board control. Shady Bartender and Demons. Shady Bartender is one of the biggest ways to push damage on your opponent. If you have a full field of demons and drop this card, how I look at this is a 2 damage increase for each minion on the field. Best case scenario is an extra 12 damage that can easily finish off an opponent. We're going to be taking a look at how this deck does against other classes and decks. The higher the ranked deck, the better our deck does against these matchups. Before we start, some of y'all might notice there's 2 priests and druids. In their tier list, these are 2 different decks in the same class. S tier druid is ramping druid, A tier druid is aggro druid, priest and C tier is average quest priest. Priest that is in F tier is Naga Priest. Let's start with the favorable matchups S and A tier. Demon Hunters. For my experience, Demon Hunters can get easily outvalued even when you're not even trading with them because they lack consistent board wipes. Ramping Druid usually can't live long enough to get to the point where they're dropping huge bombs. The only way that the Ramping Druid can survive against this deck is if they get a great draw and you get an awful curve in your original hand. Ramping Druid should really struggle to not die against this deck. There are not many warrior decks that have put up much of a fight against this deck. This deck's highest average win rate against any other class is warrior on HS replay, so I usually consider this a winning matchup. In A tier, aggro druid can beat you if they rush you and you're not able to respond. Aggro druid can outrush you, and so this is one of the only decks I play for value against because I have hero power that lets me draw more. Aggro druid will either beat you before turn 4 or steadily get outscaled and you will beat them out. One of the best ways to tell if it's aggro druid compared to a ramping druid is if they have the card Prince Renathiel, they'll have 40 health instead of 30 health. Expect them to have an aggro druid deck if they have 30 health. Now on to Paladins. I personally have had issues with Paladins when they're able to curve out and drop cards such as Lightforge Cariel. They also have a lot of healing in order to recover later in the game with plenty of options of clearing the field. With all this, Paladins shouldn't consistently be able to reach the end of the game where any of this matters. If you don't play into their board wipes, there's a high chance you'll be able to beat them down before they're able to pop off. Now the last class in A tier, Rogue. If I had to be honest, Rogue is my least favorite class to play against in Hearthstone, but when playing against them with this deck, it generally isn't too hard to beat them out. Rogues are generally known for having awful AoE board clear, and that reason alone makes playing against rogues not too difficult compared to other classes. Now on to B tier. This is what I consider even matchups for this deck. The most common mage deck is Big Spell from what I've seen. This matchup, in my opinion, is one of the biggest skill determined matchups. If you can kill them before turn 6, that is ideal. They have a lot of great options to provide them early field control to help them reach the late game, which they will dominate in. Now into C tier. Beast Hunter decks are pretty hard to play against. Rushing for early board control and getting damage in on your opponents here is important because Hunters have some really good early options that can be hard to deal with. Later in the game, they have big creatures that will simply outvalue your deck. This will be a hard deck to play against, but remember, try to kill them before they kill you. Quest Priest can be difficult to play against sometimes. After playing against this deck, you will think to yourself, how many times did that degenerate just wipe my field? Sometimes it feels like Blizzard made every board wipe for Priest and your opponent just put every single one in their deck. As well as having 1,000 different ways to heal, Priest can be extremely irritating to play against, but like always, rush them and kill them early on. Now on to Shaman. I almost put Shaman in F tier because Evolve Shaman is super strong right now and is very hard for this deck to deal with. Evolve Shaman is fairly quick to outscale this deck, so try to kill them before they evolve their field into yours. This is a very hard matchup. Now the final deck, Naga Priest deck. This is the only deck in F tier. This deck is hard to win against from my experience. Naga Priest deck is also a aggro deck, but honestly pops off way harder, way sooner than the Imp deck. It's one of the best decks in the game and does very good against the Imp deck. With that being said, that wraps up the matchups for this deck. But that is pretty much it, guys. This deck isn't too bad to grind up the higher ranks, but isn't too expensive when it comes to dust. If y'all enjoyed, please subscribe. I'll be making more deck spotlights in the future. Put in the comments what decks you would be interested in seeing next. All right, have a good one.